Welcome to Wines We Drink, a podcast for wine lovers and learners. I'm Charlotte Norsworthy Varnum, and together with my counterpart Keith Herndon, we'll be exploring a new wine each week. Keith is a lover of wine, and I'm a learner of wine, and we hope you'll sip along with us.
This one is
the tasting, no, we'll pick for three of them and then one here.
I got you.
Yeah, she's just buying the wine. Yeah, we're buying your tasting.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast that we call Wines We Drink. I'm Charlotte Norsworthy Varnum, and I'm here today with my co-host and certified wine sommelier, Keith Herndon.
Hello, Charlotte, and a big shout out to all of our listeners. We thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate the support we get from all of you. It's our 8th episode of Season 4, and we're coming to you from our home away from home, the Tapped Athens Wine Tasting Market.
Yes, the crowd chatter that opened the show and the lovely sounds of our environment kind of tell you that this is a really lively place to enjoy a glass of wine with your friends. And we, of course, must thank our friends, Todd and Angela Hurt, the Tapped proprietors, for welcoming us in to record our show today. This is our second in a 3-episode arc that we're recording here this season. So if you missed last week's episode, you can find it along with all of our previous episodes from this season and our earlier seasons on all the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We also have an episode guide for your convenience at wineswedrink.com.
Yeah, we ended last week's episode with a great interview with Todd, so check that out if you haven't heard his thoughts on wine and what he's learned from owning a wine bar. Very insightful stuff.
I know,
Yeah.
So interesting. So let's turn our attention to today's wine after we enjoyed some delicious whites, including a couple of fabulous sparkling wines and a fantastic Spanish rosé. We began our red selections last week with a light-bodied Valdigi that I'm certain was a new grape for most of our listeners. It certainly was a new grape for me. So what do you have for us today?
Well, it's the opposite of last week's red in terms of body and style. Today's wine is full-bodied, dark, and intense. But like last week's wine, this is one that's also likely going to be a new grape variety for the vast majority of our listeners.
Another unusual grape. So I'm looking forward to this. What's it called?
So Charlotte, we're drinking a wine today made from the Saperavi grape. It's a native of the country of Georgia, which many scientists and wine historians now describe as the birthplace of wine.
What? The country of Georgia as the birthplace of wine? I'm not sure if I would have associated Georgia with having that much history with wine. I mean, after all, we spend so much time talking about the rich history of wines from France and Italy and even Greece. I mean, I'm interested to learn wine that got its start elsewhere.
Yeah, I think most wine drinkers have that same perspective. But scientists have found DNA evidence embedded in ancient clay pots that trace wine's origin back 8,000 years in Georgia. It's the oldest by far of any region that has such DNA evidence supporting its history in wine. So we now understand Georgia as the cradle of wine.
Wow. Well, then it makes a lot of sense why we're talking about it today. So let's talk about Saperavi. It's certainly not a grape varietal that I'm familiar with. So how would you decide on featuring a wine like this on our episode today?
Well, I'll confess, this grape wasn't on my radar until a couple of years ago.
Okay.
That's when I noticed more Georgian wine showing up in stores. I started reading about Georgia's wine history, and so I went in search of all the Georgian wines that I could find. I mean, that was a fun exercise.
Yeah.
Then I read the Napa Valley Wine Academy, where I've studied wine before, was offering a free online course in Georgian wine. Free course? Sign me up, right?
Yep.
You know, let's just say I was further enlightened by the training, and now I'm a diehard fan of these wines.
Wow.
We hosted a tasting here at Tapped of Eastern European wines, and I included today's selection in that mix.
That's exactly what I would expect from you. When you decide to learn about something, you really go all in.
Well, I haven't traveled to Georgia yet.
True.
Okay?
The missing piece.
But it's on my bucket list, right? But meanwhile, there's so much to study in Georgian wines. I mean, there are over 500 indigenous grapes in Georgia.
Wow.
Of course, not all of those are exported, but you can find some fantastic white wines like a rare Kikvi and the Katsateli That is, the Cacciatelli is often presented as a skin contact amber wine.
Wow.
But I fell in love with this red Saperavi for all of the reasons we're going to talk about here on the show today.
Wow. I mean, a whole new world that we're exploring today. I'm so excited. Let's get started, and I'm eager to taste your newfound wine love.
Well, I love so many wines.
True.
Charlotte, there's an important trait to explain about this grape before we taste it. Saperavi is, using a French word, a teinturier grape.
Another new wine word that is a challenge to pronounce. Teinturier. What does that even mean?
Okay, it means that not only is the skin of this grape dark, but so is its juice. Most red grapes have white flesh inside that produce clear juice.
Okay.
But Saperavi is one of the rare red grapes that also has a red flesh. The red flesh and the deep red skin result in a rich, full-bodied wine.
Wow. Imagine biting into a grape and the flesh being red too. That would be a crazy experience. This sounds amazing. Can we go ahead and start pouring?
Absolutely. So I've had this in the decanter here as we were getting ready for the episode. So I'm going to pour you some there. Okay, let me bring my glass over.
How long would you say it was decanting?
About 45 minutes, probably.
Okay.
Just before we got started today on the episode. So this is a 2019 Saperavi from the Nine Oaks Winery. This wine needs at least a half an hour in the decanter to unwind and open up a bit. So as I just mentioned, I had it in the decanter for about 45 minutes. And, I think that helps it breathe a little bit more. This is a deeply wound wine. Okay.
As we've mentioned before on the show, that sometimes these reds need some time to unwind, and I think we've all can resonate with that. So, and as you were pouring it, even in the decanter, I couldn't help but notice there's such a very deep color, and it's dark purple. It's almost opaque. You can't see through the glass.
Well, on the Nine Oaks website, this wine is listed not as a red wine, but as a dry black wine.
Whoa.
Okay? From the color we're seeing, I think that's an apt description. Go ahead and put your nose in the glass and tell us what aromas you get.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, there's no surprises here when you hear a description like a black wine. It really is almost black, in not only in color, but when you think of a description like black wine, you probably think how that might translate into what you're smelling, and it is really blackberry all the way. There's also some maybe black pepper, earth coming through. I mean, it's very earthy and grounded and intense.
Yeah, this is, earth is exactly on point, right? This is truly a savory wine. You get that on the nose and on the palate. So let's go in there on that first taste and see what some of the flavor notes are coming through.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Great first sip.
Wow. I mean, without a doubt, that blackberry flavor is still there, but it's actually softer than I was expecting it to be.
Yeah, so have another sip before we do that.
Okay.
Yeah, before we talk about that. Still soft on the palate? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a dark color, and there's some intense aromas that are very savory, like you were saying, leathery or even molassesy. And so I was expecting it to be very astringent, very drying. And while it is slightly drying, it's still much smoother, I guess, than I was expecting it to be.
Well, I think the fruit flavors in this wine are its great strength, okay? Yes, it is essentially those blackberry and blackcurrant notes, but for me, there is a plum quality to this wine that gives it a sort of jamminess. And it's, of course, definitely a dry wine, but the tannins are much more relaxed than its color would indicate. That jamminess quality helps with that, I think, and it just smooths it out on the end.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely don't need to follow up your sip with any water or anything. I mean, taking more sips even now, you really start to get a sense for that complexity.
Yeah, the finish definitely has some pepper notes, and there's some herbal qualities, and I have to admit, I wasn't really able to discern exactly what I was thinking that herbal quality was, so I turned to the tasting notes, and they call it thyme.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that makes sense. And what's surprising to me about the finish is that you kind of start to sense another fruit really coming forward. It's like tart cherry juice there right at the end.
Yeah, you're spot on with that observation. I think the official notes say that the back end strikes with notes of sour cherry.
Okay,
I mean, you
yeah.
called it tart cherry, sour cherry,
Right.
same.
If you've ever
same
had
thing.
tart cherry juice, I mean, this right here is a robust wine. It's got a lot of deep, intense flavors, and because of that, I think even tasting it, I'm expecting it to kind of be up there in its alcohol content. Am I right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You are right about the alcohol content. There is nothing subtle about this wine. Its color is dark, its dense flavors are dark berries, and its alcohol content checks in at the high end of the range at 15%.
Okay. Yep. There we go. I mean, even with that high alcohol content, I think it's still very drinkable. But I really think it needs a partner, right? So, how would you pair this Saperavi with food?
Yeah, and I'll go back to that. Even though it's at 15%, you don't really get an alcohol burn with this,
Right.
right? The finish is so soft and smooth, even with all this tannin structure that we talked about. So I think the first reaction to pairing this with food is many people would be a hearty steak, right?
You're speaking my language.
Right, and you certainly would not go wrong serving this wine as an accompaniment to a nice sirloin or a ribeye, But I think this wine has a flavor profile that makes it incredibly flexible when when you're considering your food pairings. I think an even better pairing than steak would be roasted pork medallions.
Oh.
Right, and you can add in an unsweetened currant or cherry glaze to kind of complement some of these fruit flavors that we're getting there, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think a pork chop would be good? A pork
Absolutely.
tenderloin?
That wasn't the first thing to pop to my brain, because if anyone knows me who's listening knows I love a steak. And so red wine and steak, that is like, if I have nothing else, I will have that. That is just so scrumptious. So it feels like naturally you would think to pair it with red meat, but then you don't really think about pork first, probably.
Right. Well, I'm going to challenge you to think even further outside of the box.
Okay.
Right? This would work really nicely with roasted duck and some of those same glazes, that unsweetened cherry glaze. Duck is a fatter, more gamey poultry option, and this wine's acidity and tannic structure would complement that so well.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. And when you think about the uniqueness of a wine like this, at least from my perspective, duck also feels like a very special occasion type of meat. That would just be, oh my gosh, a match made in heaven, it sounds like. But you know me, I also am a sucker for a wine and cheese pairing. I'm a wine and cheese gal at heart. What cheese would you recommend for this wine?
This bowl of wine needs a hearty, salty cheese to stand up to it. So for me, I'm going with an Italian pecorino cheese. I have some pecorino romano sliced there for you to try with this wine.
Okay, don't mind if I do.
Right, it's a little crumbly.
Okay, you're right.
It's a hard cheese.
Oh, wow. You're right, though. That saltiness of the cheese and the tartness of the wine plays off of each other so nicely. Like you said, it's a hard cheese, so it's kind of crumbly, but it really creates a creamy texture as you eat it, and that creaminess also really works well with this wine.
Pecorino is a sheep's milk cheese, and it comes in a variety of styles, but the Romano style is my favorite with this wine. It has the sharpness needed to work with this dense, intense red wine that we're drinking.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It feels natural that these two would complement one another in that way, and the sort of savory notes of the wine are really brought out by that salt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, everyone, it's time for us to step away for a short break, and I'm going to finish eating my cheese and wine. But we'll be back shortly with a segment of the show that we call The Finish, and we'll hear Keith talk more about this Saperavi wine. Welcome back to Wines We Drink. This is the portion of the show that we call The Finish. Today, Keith is going to tell us more about Georgian wines, and especially more about the winery and the region that produced today's selection. But first, I'm going to need to circle back about the price, right? We left that out of the previous segment. So today's bottle, it's an important detail. Could you kind of break it down for us?
Yeah, Charlotte, we almost never miss that before the break.
I
You're
know.
so focused on price, right? But I think this is another win in the price to quality ratio. Our listeners should be able to find a 9 Oak Saperavi priced between $25 and $35 a bottle.
Okay.
I paid $28 for this 2019 vintage, but go for another vintage if you can't find this one. The more recent vintages are shaping up really nicely, and overall, a 9 Oak Saperavi is ranked among the top 6% of wines in the world on the Vivino app.
I mean, that's a great price and a great ranking, all things considered. But can we find readily these Georgian wines?
Now we can.
Okay.
Okay. Before 2006, 95% of their exports went to Russia. But then a Russian embargo forced the Georgian winemakers to find other markets, and they've been expanding ever since. Exports to Europe and the U.S. are up substantially. So yes, your favorite wine shops will either have Georgian wines on the shelves or they can get them for you.
Okay. Well, what about some shopping tips then for our listeners? What else should they know if they venture out to their favorite wine store for some Georgian wine?
Great question, Charlotte. First of all, consumers need to understand that there are 10 prominent wine-producing regions in Georgia, but Kakheti is the most prominent and is probably enjoying the best reputation at the moment. So you'll most likely find that Georgian wines that you'll find in your stores will most likely be from Kakheti.
Okay. So Kakheti is Georgia's Napa Valley.
Yeah, that's a great way to think of it. Another particularly important aspect of winemaking in Georgia that consumers need to understand is this concept of the quavery.
Okay.
Consumers should be familiar with what that means because when they're reading about Georgian wines, the concept of the quavery is going to come up.
Okay, well, and that's another new wine word. Quavery, that's spelled with a Q if you're reading it. What does it mean?
Okay, a quavery is a giant terracotta clay pot. It's shaped like a big egg, and they bury it underground. So in the traditional winemaking methods of Georgia, these vessels are used for fermenting the juice.
Okay, so the Saperavi we drank today was fermented in one of these large clay pots. It's quavery?
Yes. One of the reasons I chose this particular bottle to feature is 9 Oak's commitment to the traditional methods. 9 Oaks farms organically, no chemicals. Once harvested, the grapes for today's wines were destemmed and then they macerated with full skin contact and were allowed to naturally ferment, no added yeast, for 28 days. And this fermentation occurred in these large quavery, 5,600 liters, right?
Wow.
That's a big pot.
Yeah.
And it was buried underground to maintain this constant natural cool temperature, right? The wine is then moved to stainless steel tanks where it remains in contact with lees, the yeast sediment, for another 60 days. So the wine is then separated from the lees but remains in the tank until it's bottled in about a year.
Wow,
Right.
What an intense process. So there's no oak involved.
No oak, right? The tannic structure that we talked about earlier is all from its dark skins and that unique red flesh. And I think the results are amazingly good.
Yeah, I mean, you're right about that. And I can't wait to be engaging more in the Georgian wine space. So that's the finish for today's episode and another episode of Wines We Drink. We'll be back here at Tapped Athens Wine Tasting Market for next week's episode. But Keith, what do you have planned for us?
Well, Charlotte, we're going to be back in the U.S. on the West Coast for next week's selection. But the wine that we'll be drinking next week presents another unique approach. And full disclosure, Todd Herp of Tapped introduced me to the wine we're drinking next week, and it's a red beauty.
Todd has never steered you wrong, nor me, in his selection, so I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, everyone, and cheers.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Please join us again next week. We love having you along for our wine journey. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Wines We Drink. Listen to our other episodes anywhere you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Instagram at The Wines We Drink, and check out our episode guides at wineswedrink.com. Cheers.